My name is Violet, and the night my parents kicked me out of their house, I was too tired to even fight back. Too exhausted from working 2 jobs just to keep a roof over their heads, to realize that somehow, despite everything I'd done, it still wasn't enough for them. I was 24 years old, and my days had blurred into this endless cycle of answering phones and filing paperwork at a law firm downtown, then rushing across town to wait tables at a diner until midnight, my feet aching constantly, and my back hurting from standing all day. And I honestly couldn't remember the last time I'd slept more than 5 hours straight, but I kept telling myself it was temporary, that I was helping my family get through a rough patch, that things would eventually get better. I was wrong about all of it. That Tuesday started like any other grueling day. Double shift with barely any tips and a manager who thought yelling solved every problem. And when I finally pulled into the driveway just after 11 at night, all I wanted was to collapse into bed. But the moment I walked through the front door, I knew something was off because the living room lights were blazing, and my parents were sitting on the couch like they'd been waiting for me. And my younger sister Madison was perched in the armchair, with this weird expression on her face, nervous and almost guilty, but with something else there I couldn't quite read. "Sit down, Violet," my mother said, her voice tight and clipped. But I didn't sit, because I was too exhausted to play along with whatever this was. "What's going on?" Madison glanced at our parents, then back at me, and said quietly, "I'm pregnant." For a second, I just stood there trying to process it, because Madison was 21 and still living at home, still bouncing between part-time jobs that never seemed to last more than a few months, and she'd been dating this guy Derek for about 6 months. But I hadn't seen him around lately, so I said the only thing I could think of. "Does Derek know?" "He left," Madison said, her voice cracking as she continued. "He said he wasn't ready to be a dad and just took off, and I felt a pang of sympathy for her then, because whatever else Madison was, she didn't deserve that. "I'm sorry, Maddie. That's awful." My mother stood up abruptly, and her voice went sharp. "Madison needs support right now, not your pity. She's going to need space, a proper room for the baby." I looked at her, confused, because we had a guest room that was basically storage at that point. "Okay, so we can clean out your room," my father cut in, his voice flat and matter-of-fact like he was telling me to pass the salt, and he just kept going like it was already decided. "Madison needs your room. It's bigger, better for a nursery." I actually laughed, because surely he was joking. "Wait, what? Where am I supposed to sleep?" "That's your problem to figure out," he said, and his face was completely serious as he added, "Pack your stuff and get out. Our princess needs space." And the words hit me like a punch to the gut. I looked at my mother, waiting for her to jump in and say he was being ridiculous, but she just stood there with her arms crossed, nodding along like this made perfect sense. And when I finally found my voice, it came out shaking. "You can't be serious. I've been paying most of the bills here for 2 years. The rent, the utilities, groceries, half of it comes from me." My father stood up then and started yelling, really yelling in a way that made me take a step back. "We don't care. You'll keep paying the bills. You were born to serve us. Madison is delicate. She needs to be taken care of. You're strong. You'll figure it out." "This is insane," I said, looking at each of them in turn, searching for some sign that they understood how crazy this was. "You're throwing me out but expecting me to keep bankrolling you." My mother stepped closer, and her voice dropped to that ice-cold tone she used when she wanted to make sure you understood she meant business. "Madison is carrying our grandchild. She deserves comfort and support. You've always been independent, Violet. You don't need us the way she does." I looked at Madison then, really looked at her, waiting for her to say something, anything, to tell them this was crazy, that she didn't want this, but she just sat there staring at her hands in complete silence. And that's when I understood that this wasn't a sudden decision, that they'd discussed this and planned it and decided I was expendable, that I'd never actually mattered to them at all except as a source of income. Something shifted inside me then, something hard and final clicking into place, and I heard myself say quietly, "Fine, I'll pack," which seemed to surprise my father because he'd probably expected more of a fight. Rent is due on the 1st, same as always, $800. Don't be late, he said, already turning back to the couch like I'd already stopped existing to him. I didn't respond, just turned and walked upstairs to my room while their voices faded behind me, and my mother started fussing over Madison like she was made of glass. And it took me less than an hour to pack my entire life into 2 suitcases and a backpack, because I didn't have much, had never been able to afford much. And when I stood in the doorway looking at the room that had been mine since I was 8 years old, I felt absolutely nothing. Just this strange empty space where emotions should have been. When I came back downstairs, they were still in the living room, and Madison looked up at me, opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but then closed it again and dropped her eyes, and I walked past all of them without a word, because there was nothing left to say. Outside it had started to rain, a cold drizzle that soaked through my jacket immediately, and I threw my bags in the back of my beat-up Honda and slid into the driver's seat and just sat there for a minute gripping the steering wheel, trying to process the fact that I had $243 in my checking account, no place to go, and a family that had just made it crystal clear exactly how little I meant to them. But as I started the engine and pulled away from that house, watching it disappear in my rearview mirror, I made myself a promise. I was done being their ATM, and somehow, some way, I was going to make sure they regretted this. I spent that first night in my car, driving around for maybe an hour with the rain hammering against the windshield while I tried to figure out where to go. But a hotel was out of the question, because I couldn't afford to burn through what little money I had, and I thought about calling my friend Jenna, but it was past midnight, and I didn't want to wake her up with my mess, so I ended up parking in the lot behind the diner where I worked, reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go, and tried to sleep. It didn't work, because every time a car drove past I jolted awake, and the parking lot lights were too bright, and the seat was uncomfortable, and my mind wouldn't stop replaying that scene in the living room. My father's face when he said I was born to serve them, my mother's cold dismissal, Madison's silence, and by the time the sun came up, I felt like I'd been hit by a truck. I used the diner's bathroom to clean up before my shift at the law firm, washing my face in the sink and trying to make myself look somewhat presentable. But the woman staring back at me in the mirror looked exhausted and defeated, and I barely recognized her. Work was a blur of answering phones and filing documents and smiling when I was supposed to smile, and nobody noticed anything was wrong, or if they did, they didn't care enough to ask. So at lunch, I sat in my car and ate a granola bar from my glove compartment because that was all I had, and that's when my phone buzzed with a text from my father that said, "Rent is due on the 1st, $800. Don't be late." I stared at that message for a long time, the audacity of it making my hands shake, because I wanted to throw my phone across the parking lot, but instead I opened my banking app and checked my account balance, and there it was, $243, which meant if I paid them $800, I'd have to pull from my already maxed out credit card. And then what? I'd be in debt and homeless, and still expected to fund their lives while they gave my room to Madison and her baby. I was still sitting there spiraling when someone knocked on my car window and I jumped, then saw it was Jenna from the diner, and she must have been heading home after the morning shift, because she looked at me with those sharp eyes that never missed anything and said, "You okay? You look rough." "I'm fine," I said automatically, but she leaned against my car and gave me this look like she knew I was lying. "Violet, I've known you for 3 years. You're not fine. What's going on?" And just like that, I broke. Maybe because of the lack of sleep, or maybe because of the text from my father still burning on my phone screen, but everything came pouring out about Madison's pregnancy, and being kicked out, and them still expecting me to pay their bills, and Jenna listened without interrupting, her expression getting darker with every word until I finally finished, and she was quiet for a moment before, saying, "That's messed up, like seriously messed up. Where did you sleep last night?" I gestured at the car, and she said immediately, "Absolutely not. You're staying with me. I've got a couch, and it's not much, but it's better than this." And when I tried to protest, she pulled out her phone and texted me her address, adding, "Come over after your shift tonight. I'll leave the door unlocked if I'm already asleep. And seriously, Violet, you need to stop paying them because what are they going to do? Kick you out? Already did that. She had a point, but the guilt was already creeping in. And when I said, they'll lose the house, she just looked at me and said bluntly, let them. They're grown adults who've been taking advantage of you for years. Time they learn to stand on their own feet. My evening shift at the diner was brutal, my feet hurting and my head aching, and I kept messing up orders because I couldn't focus. But when I finally clocked out just before midnight, I felt like I could sleep for a week. So I drove to Jenna's apartment, a tiny studio on the 3rd floor of an old building. And true to her word, she'd left it unlocked and was already asleep in her bed with sheets and a pillow laid out on the couch for me. I stood there in her small living room looking at that couch, at this tiny act of kindness from someone who barely knew my full story, and something shifted in my chest, something that felt almost like hope, and I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app and wrote, Day 1, I'm done being their ATM, because I didn't know how yet, and I didn't know what would happen when I stopped paying. But sitting there in the dark of Jenna's apartment, I made a decision that I was going to find out. I turned off my phone and lay down on that uncomfortable couch, and for the first time in 24 hours, I slept. I paid them for 2 more months. And I know what you're thinking, because I was thinking it too, that after everything I'd said about being done and not being their ATM anymore, I still sent that $800 when the first of the month rolled around, and then I did it again 30 days later, because the guilt was too heavy. And every time I thought about stopping, I imagined my parents losing the house, and Madison and the baby out on the street. Never mind that they'd put me out on the street without a second thought, but old habits die hard, I guess. But while I was paying them, I was also planning, taking every overtime shift I could get at both jobs, and stopping buying coffee and making my own lunch instead of grabbing fast food and selling the few things I owned that had any value, my old laptop and some jewelry my grandmother had left me, and a designer purse I'd saved up for years ago. And every single dollar went into a secret savings account they didn't know existed. Jenna's couch became my home base, and she never complained, never made me feel like a burden even though I definitely was one. And we'd stay up late sometimes talking about everything and nothing, and she told me about her own messy family and why she'd moved across the state to get away from them, and it helped knowing I wasn't the only one. My mother called a few times during those 2 months, but never to ask how I was doing. It was always about money, asking if I could send $200 for Madison's maternity clothes, or $500 for a broken water heater, or asking me to cover expensive prenatal vitamins. And the first few times I said I couldn't afford it, she'd get cold and tell me I was being selfish, and remind me that family takes care of family. But by the 3rd call, I stopped answering altogether. And then she left me a voicemail that I listened to exactly once where she said, You're being incredibly selfish, Violet. Your sister is pregnant and struggling and you can't even help out your own family? I raised you better than this. Call me back. And I deleted it and blocked her number. It was around that time that I met Alex, this regular at the diner who always came in around 9 on weeknights and ordered coffee and whatever pie we had and sat in the corner booth working on his laptop. And I'd noticed him before mostly because he was one of the few customers who actually said, please and thank you, and always left good tips. And one night during a rare slow period, he caught me reading an article on my phone about tenant rights and asked, Rough landlord? I laughed, but it came out bitter, and I said, You could say that. And he told me about a landlord he'd once had who tried to keep his entire security deposit because he'd hung pictures on the walls, and how he'd taken the guy to small claims court and won. And when I said, Good for you, he held out his hand and said, Alex, by the way. And I shook it and said, Violet. After that, we started talking more. Nothing heavy, just small conversations when the diner was quiet. And I learned he was 28 and did freelance graphic design and had moved to the city 2 years ago. And he was easy to talk to in this low-key, funny way that didn't try too hard, and he never pushed or asked questions I didn't want to answer. So when he asked one night if I wanted to grab coffee sometime, actually grab coffee, not just refill his cup at the diner, I almost said no. Because I was exhausted and broke and sleeping on a couch and definitely not in a place to be dating anyone. But there was something about the way he asked, casual and genuine with no pressure, that made me say yes. We met on my day off at this little cafe that had free refills and talked for 3 hours. And I didn't tell him everything, but I told him enough about working 2 jobs and family complications and trying to save enough money to get my own place. And he told me about his family too, how his parents had divorced when he was young, and how he'd spent years trying to please both of them before he realized he couldn't, and how he'd eventually had to choose himself over their expectations. And when I told him I felt guilty about my situation, he said, "It's not selfish. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's survival." And I wanted to believe him. By the end of month 2, I'd saved $1,400. And it wasn't much, but it was enough because I found a listing for a room in a shared house across town. $350 a month with utilities included. And the room was tiny, barely bigger than a closet, and I'd be sharing a bathroom with 2 other people, but it was going to be mine. I met the landlord and signed the lease and moved in on a Saturday with Jenna helping me carry my 2 suitcases up the stairs. And when we stood in that tiny room together, she hugged me tight and said, "I'm proud of you." And that night after she left, I sat on the floor of my new room and pulled out my phone and looked at the message I'd been drafting to my parents for weeks, deleting it and rewriting it over and over. But finally, I just kept it simple. "I'm done paying your bills. Figure it out yourselves." I hit send before I could second-guess myself, and then immediately turned off my phone, my hands shaking and my heart racing, and part of me wanted to take it back and call them and apologize and promise to keep helping, but I didn't. The calls started within an hour, or at least that's what I discovered when I turned my phone back on the next morning and found 17 missed calls from my father and 9 from my mother, and a string of text messages that got progressively more unhinged, starting with my father's angry, "How dare you stop paying? Call me right now," and turning threatening with, "You're going to regret this, Violet, I mean it," before finally landing on desperate with, "We're going to lose everything because of you. Is that what you want?" My mother's texts were different, dripping with guilt and manipulation about how my father had a panic attack because of what I did, and how Madison was so stressed she could barely eat, and the doctor said stress was bad for the baby, and after everything they'd done for me, this was how I repaid them, and I read every single one with my stomach twisting tighter with each word before I blocked both their numbers. Madison's text came next, saying, "Vi, please, I know you're mad, but we really need help. I don't know what to do, and how can you abandon your own niece before she's even born?" And ending with, "I thought you were better than this." And I stared at that last message for a long time because the Madison I'd grown up with, the little sister I'd protected from bullies and helped with homework, felt like a stranger then. Or maybe I was finally seeing her clearly for the first time. So I blocked her too. For about a week, I felt okay. Guilty, sure, but also lighter. Working my shifts and coming home to my tiny room and actually keeping the money I earned. And I even bought myself new work shoes, because my old ones had holes in the soles and I'd been ignoring it for months. But then Jenna showed me the Facebook post. We were on break at the diner when she pulled out her phone with her face tight with anger and said, "You need to see this, but it's going to piss you off." And it was from my mother's account posted 2 days earlier, this long paragraph about family betrayal and how she'd raised an ungrateful daughter who'd abandoned them in their time of need. And she didn't use my name, but she didn't have to, because everyone who knew our family would know exactly who she was talking about. The post said, "Our youngest is pregnant and struggling, and her older sister walked away from us without a second thought. We gave her everything, supported her through everything, and this is how she repays us. Some people are just born selfish, I suppose. Praying for her to find her way back to family values." And the comments were worse. Family friends I'd known my whole life and people who'd watched me grow up all piling on about how they always thought there was something off about me and poor Madison having to deal with this while pregnant and how my parents deserved better because family should stick together. A few people I'd gone to high school with sent me direct messages and most of them weren't kind. And I felt sick showing Jenna my phone with my hands shaking, saying, "They're making me the villain." And she said flatly, "Because they need someone to blame. They can't admit their failures, so they're blaming you. It's textbook narcissist behavior." And I knew she was right, but it still hurt because these were people who'd known me for years and they were so quick to believe I was the bad guy. Alex called that night, and we'd been texting pretty regularly since our coffee date, and I'd told him bits and pieces about my family. So when I told him about the Facebook post, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "People who really know you will see the truth. The others don't matter." I know that's easy to say and hard to believe, but it's true. And when I asked in a small voice, "What if they're right? What if I am selfish?" his voice got firm, and he said, "Violet, you worked 2 jobs too. Pay their bills for 2 years. You gave them everything you had. Walking away from people who were using you isn't selfish. It's self-preservation." We talked for over an hour that night, and he told me about cutting off his own father who'd been emotionally abusive for years, about how hard it was at first and how guilty he felt, but how much better his life got once he stopped setting himself on fire to keep other people warm, and he promised, "It gets easier, the guilt fades, you start to see things clearly." A few days later, Jenna mentioned she'd run into her neighbor who knew someone who knew my parents, and apparently they were already behind on bills, and the electricity had been shut off for a day before they scraped together enough to get it turned back on. And I felt a sharp pang of guilt when she told me, but it was smaller than before, more manageable. That same week, I got a promotion at the law firm. Just a small one, but it came with a $1.50 raise. And it wasn't much. But when my boss told me, I felt something shift in my chest, because I was moving forward, slowly and painfully, but forward. And that Friday, when Alex asked if I wanted to go to a free outdoor movie screening in the park, we sat on a blanket he'd brought and shared popcorn he'd made at home. And halfway through, he reached over and took my hand, and gave me this small, tentative smile like he wasn't sure if it was okay. So I squeezed his hand back. For the first time since that rainy night when I'd walked out of my parents' house, I felt something that wasn't guilt or anger or fear, and it felt a lot like hope. 3 months passed since I'd cut them off financially, and I was thriving in my own quiet way, living in my tiny room and saving money, and my relationship with Alex had become official. And we were happy together in this simple, authentic way I'd never experienced before. But then one Tuesday afternoon, Madison showed up at the law firm. The receptionist buzzed me, sounding confused, and said, "There's a Madison here to see you. Says she's your sister." And my stomach dropped because I almost told her to send Madison away. But curiosity won out, so I said, "I'll be right there," and found Madison waiting in the lobby, visibly pregnant now, maybe 6 months along, looking exhausted with dark circles under her eyes and her clothes rumpled. Nothing like the pampered princess I'd left behind. "Can we talk?" she asked quietly, adding, "Please." And I hesitated before nodding and saying, "There's a coffee shop across the street." We sat at a corner table with awkward silence stretching between us while I waited for her to explain why she was there, and she finally said, "Things are really bad at home. Dad lost his job 3 weeks ago. He got into it with his boss and got fired on the spot, and Mom's only working part-time at the grocery store, and it's not enough." And she paused before continuing, "They're gonna lose the house. The bank sent a foreclosure notice last week. Vi, I don't know what to do. The baby comes in 2 months. And you want money?" I said flatly. But she shook her head and said, "I want help. I know you're mad. I get it, but..." And I interrupted. Do you really get it, Madison? Because you sat there and said nothing while they threw me out. You didn't even try to stop them." She looked down at her hands and said quietly, "I didn't know they were making you pay for everything. They told me you wanted to help, that you insisted on contributing. And that surprised me because I stared at her trying to figure out if she was lying. But she looked genuinely shocked and genuinely hurt. So I said slowly, "They lied to you. For 2 years I paid more than half of every bill in that house. Rent and utilities and groceries. All of it. I worked myself to exhaustion so they could live comfortably." Madison's eyes filled with tears as she said, "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know." But I said, and my voice came out harder than I'd intended, "But you never asked, did you? It was easier not to know, easier to just let them take care of you while I paid for it all." She cried then, really cried, and part of me felt bad, but the bigger part, the part that had slept in her car and eaten granola bars for dinner, didn't feel bad at all. And when she whispered, "I'm sorry, you're right. I should have asked. I should have noticed. I was just so wrapped up in my own problems, I said. And now you want me to bail you out. I don't know what else to do, she admitted, her voice breaking as she continued. I got a job at a fast food place, but it's barely minimum wage. Mom and Dad can't help me anymore. Derek's gone. I'm going to have a baby and nowhere to live. And I felt a flicker of compassion, then looking at my sister, really looking at her, because she seemed so young and so scared. But I also remembered every sleepless night, and every skipped meal, and every time I'd chosen their comfort over my own needs. I can't save you all from the mess they created, I said finally, standing up from the table. You're an adult, Madison. You made choices that got you here. It's time to act like one and figure it out. Her face crumpled as she said, So that's it? You're just going to let us lose everything? But I shook my head and said, I'm not letting you do anything. This isn't my responsibility. It never should have been. And I left her there crying into her coffee and walked back to work with my heart pounding. That night I called Alex with my hands shaking and asked, Did I do the right thing? And he said gently, You offered her truth, not money. That's more valuable. She needs to learn to stand on her own feet just like you did. And a few days later, I got a notification on my phone showing that someone had tried to access my old bank account, the one I'd closed months ago, and it was my father's email address in the access log. They were desperate enough to try stealing from me, and I stared at that notification for a long time, feeling something inside me harden into certainty, because I'd made the right choice, and I wasn't looking back. 2 weeks after Madison showed up at my work, my father called from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered without thinking, his voice coming through unfamiliar in its meekness as he said, Violet, please don't hang up. And I almost hung up anyway, but something in his tone stopped me. We need $5,000 to save the house, he said, the words tumbling out in a rush. The bank gave us one more chance. If we can pay that, we can work out a payment plan. I'll pay you back, I promise, every cent. And I was silent for a long moment, trying to process that this was the man who'd screamed at me that I was born to serve them, who'd thrown me out without a second thought. And now he was begging. You had years to save money, I said quietly. Years where you could have been responsible instead of spending on Madison's whims while I paid your bills. I can't help you. And he started to say, Violet, please. But I hung up, my hands shaking but feeling strangely calm because a week ago, that call would have destroyed me. But something had shifted after my conversation with Madison, and I was seeing things more clearly. Days later, Jenna told me that my family had been forced to move, that they'd found a small, cheap apartment on the far side of town with 2 bedrooms and 1 bathroom, and Madison sleeping on the couch. And she added, She got a job at McDonald's. Your mom's working full-time now at the grocery store. Your dad's doing odd jobs, handyman stuff. And I felt that familiar pang of guilt. But it was duller now, more manageable. And Jenna said, They're learning what real life looks like, what you've known all along. Around that same time, Alex suggested I try therapy, saying gently, You've been through a lot. It might help to talk to someone professional about it. So I found a therapist who worked on a sliding scale, charging what I could afford. And in our first session, I told her everything about the years of financial abuse and the sudden eviction and the guilt I'd been carrying. And she said something that hit me like a freight train. You were parentified, forced into a caretaker role that should never have been yours. What you're feeling isn't guilt. It's grief. You're mourning the family you deserved but never had. I cried in her office then. Really cried for the first time since all of this started. And over the next few weeks, therapy helped me see patterns I'd missed. How my parents had trained me from childhood to put everyone else first, and made me feel responsible for their happiness and their stability, and their very survival. And my therapist kept reminding me, setting boundaries isn't cruelty, it's self-preservation. Meanwhile, my relationship with Alex was deepening, because he'd gotten offered a major freelance project in another city, 3 months of work that would really boost his career, and he wanted me to come with him. But I just started building stability in my own life. So we talked about it over dinner at his apartment, and he said, I don't want to lose what we have. And I admitted, neither do I, but I can't uproot myself right now. I'm just starting to feel solid. And he nodded with, understanding in his eyes, and said, "Long distance?" And I agreed. Long distance. Because the fact that we could have that conversation, that we could choose what was best for each of us without resentment, felt revolutionary to me. Like this was what healthy looked like. A week before Alex was set to leave, I got a letter in the mail with my mother's handwriting on the envelope, and I stared at it for a long time with my heart racing because part of me wanted to throw it away unopened, but I needed to know. So I opened it carefully and unfolded the single page inside, and it wasn't an apology. It was an accusation. My mother blamed me for destroying the family and for Madison's pregnancy complications from stress, and for my father's depression, writing that some people were just born selfish, and she hoped I could live with myself, and the letter ended with, "You've broken your father's heart. I hope whatever happiness you found was worth it." And I read it twice, feeling sick, before showing it to my therapist at our next session. "This is abuse," she said simply. "Emotional manipulation designed to make you doubt yourself. Don't let it work." And that night, I wrote a response pouring everything into it, every truth I'd never been allowed to say. And then I folded it and put it in a drawer and never sent it, because the act of writing it had been enough. I didn't need them to hear it. I just needed to say it. Alex left for his project 2 days later, and we said goodbye at his apartment, promising video calls and visits when we could manage them. And after he was gone, I sat in my tiny room and looked around at the space that was mine, paid for with money I'd earned, at the life I was building piece by piece, and for the first time in months I smiled. I kept my mother's letter in my drawer for a week before I finally had the courage to read it again in therapy, and my therapist listened as I read it aloud, with my voice shaking on certain phrases. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment before asking, "Do you see the projection here? She's accusing you of everything she's guilty of. The selfishness and the cruelty and the abandonment. That's not about you, Violet. That's about her own inability to take responsibility." She encouraged me to write a response, not to send but to process, so I did, writing pages and pages of everything I'd never been allowed to say, how they'd used me and made me responsible for their choices and thrown me away the moment I stopped being useful, and writing it was cathartic in a way I hadn't expected, like something inside me was finally being released. Around that same time, I saw on social media that Madison had given birth to a healthy baby girl, 7 pounds 3 ounces, and the photos showed Madison looking exhausted but happy with my mother beaming beside her, and my father holding the baby with tears in his eyes, and I stared at those photos for a long time, feeling this complex mix of emotions, sadness that I'd never meet my niece, and relief that I wasn't trapped in that dysfunction anymore, but also something else, something unexpected. That felt a lot like peace. I closed the app and didn't look back, and when Alex returned from his project 2 weeks later, he surprised me by showing up at my door a day early with flowers from the grocery store and that shy smile. And when I opened the door and saw him standing there, I actually laughed and said, "You're early." And he replied, "Couldn't wait." We spent that evening catching up, and he told me about the project, how it had gone so well that the client wanted to keep him on retainer, and he could work remotely now, permanently, with stable income. And I said, genuinely happy for him. "That's amazing." But then he told me something else, saying, "I've been thinking, I don't want to do long distance anymore." And my heart sank as I started to say, "Alex," but he continued, "I want to find a place here, stay in the city if that's okay with you." I looked at him then, this man who'd supported me through the worst period of my life without trying to fix me or save me, who'd just been there steady and kind. And I said softly, "I'd like that." A few days later, I got news at work that I'd been promoted to administrative assistant with a significant raise. Not huge, but enough that I could breathe a little easier. And for the first time in my life, I was financially comfortable on my own merit, not scraping by or sacrificing everything, but actually, okay. So Alex and I decided to look for an apartment together, something small but ours, and we found a 1-bedroom in a decent neighborhood with good light and a kitchen that actually fit 2 people. The day we moved in, we spent hours unpacking boxes and assembling furniture from IKEA, And at some point we got into a paint fight while touching up the bedroom walls, and I laughed so hard I cried. And later, covered in paint splatters and eating pizza on the floor, Alex looked at me and asked, "You happy?" And I thought about it, really thought about it, before saying, "Yeah, I actually am." That night, lying in our new bedroom, I had a moment of clarity and whispered it out loud just to hear how it sounded. "I don't miss them. I miss the family I wished I had." And Alex pulled me closer and said, "You're building your own family now, the one you choose." And he was right, because Jenna had given me a place to stay when I had nothing, and Alex had shown me what a healthy relationship looked like, and my therapist had helped me untangle years of damage, and even my coworkers had. Started inviting me to lunch, and actually seemed to care how I was doing. This was my family now, not perfect but real, based on respect and choice instead of obligation and guilt. And I fell asleep that night feeling something I hadn't felt in years, something that felt a lot like safety. 3 days later, I started a blog, anonymous and simple, just me telling my story about toxic families and financial abuse and the courage it took to walk away. And I didn't expect anyone to read it, but within a week I got my first comment saying, "Thank you for sharing this. I thought I was the only one." And then another and another. People finding my words and seeing themselves in my story. And somehow, that felt like the best revenge of all. Just helping people by telling the truth. 6 months passed since Alex and I moved in together, and my life had become something I'd never imagined it could be, because I was thriving with a stable job, and decent pay, and a cozy apartment with someone who loved me, and I was seeing my therapist regularly, while my anonymous blog had grown to a few hundred followers, people who shared their own stories of family dysfunction and finding freedom, and I was happy, really genuinely happy. Then one Saturday morning I ran into Madison at the grocery store, standing in the cereal aisle debating between brands, when I heard a baby fussing nearby, and I looked up, and there she was with a shopping cart and a diaper bag over her shoulder, and a baby girl in the seat, and our eyes met, and for a second, neither of us moved before she said quietly, "Violet." And I replied, "Madison." The baby was beautiful, with dark hair and big eyes, maybe 4 months old, looking around curiously and completely unaware of the tension between her mother and aunt. And Madison asked, "Can we talk? Just for a minute?" And I almost said no, but something in her face, this kind of weariness I recognized, made me agree. "There's a bench outside." We sat on a bench in front of the store with Madison rocking the stroller gently while I waited for her to speak, and she finally said, "I'm sorry, for everything, for not standing up for you and for being spoiled and blind. You were right about everything." And I looked at her trying to gauge if this was real or just another manipulation. But she looked different, older somehow, tired in a way that went deeper than lack of sleep. "Living in the real world opened my eyes," she continued, her voice quiet and sincere. "Working and paying bills and trying to raise Emma alone while Mom and Dad are struggling too. I get it now, what you went through for years." And when I asked softly, "Emma?" she smiled just a little and said, "Yeah, Emma Rose." And I looked at my niece, this tiny person who was innocent in all of this, and said, "She's beautiful." "Thank you," Madison said, and she was quiet for a moment before adding, "Mom and Dad still blame you for everything. They haven't changed. But I have. Or at least I'm trying to." And I asked, genuinely curious, "What happened after the move?" And she sighed deeply before telling me, "It's been hard, really hard. Dad's working construction now and comes home exhausted every night. Mom's still at the grocery store complaining constantly, and I'm working at McDonald's trying to save for my own place because living with them is suffocating." "You want to move out?" I asked, surprised. And she said with determination in her voice, "I need to. For Emma, I don't want her growing up thinking that's what family looks like. The blame and the manipulation and the guilt trips. I want better for her." And that surprised me because I said, "That's good, Madison, really good. I'm not asking for money," she added quickly, "or for you to forgive me and pretend everything's fine. I just wanted you to know that I see it now. I see what they did to you, what I let them do. And I sat with that for a moment, feeling this complicated mix of emotions, anger at the years lost, and sadness for what we could have been as sisters, but also something else, something lighter. "I forgive you," I said slowly, watching her face carefully. "But forgiveness doesn't mean going back to how things were. I hope you build a good life for Emma. I really do. But I can't be part of your life. Not right now. Maybe not ever." And Madison's eyes filled with tears, but she nodded and said, "I understand. Thank you for even talking to me." She stood up, adjusting the diaper bag, and said, "Take care of yourself, Violet." And I replied, "You too, Madison." And I watched her walk back to her car with Emma babbling happily in the stroller. And I felt something settle in my chest, something that felt like closure. I drove home and found Alex making lunch in our kitchen, and when he saw my face, he immediately came over and asked, "You okay?" And I told him about running into Madison and the conversation and the weird mix of emotions I was feeling. And he pulled me into a hug and asked, "How do you feel now?" And I said, realizing it was true. At peace, I forgave her, but I didn't go back, and that feels right. That evening, I wrote a new blog post about forgiveness versus reconciliation, about how you could forgive someone and still choose not to have them in your life, and how that wasn't cruel. It was healthy. And the comments poured in with people thanking me and sharing their own stories and finding permission to set boundaries they'd been afraid to set. I sat at our little kitchen table reading through them while Alex brought me tea, and he said, "You're helping people." And I replied, "I'm helping myself too." And he kissed the top of my head and said, "That's allowed, helping yourself." And I smiled because, yeah, I'd finally learned that it was. A year and a half after that rainy night when I walked out with 2 suitcases, my life had become unrecognizable in the best possible way, because I'd completed a certificate in office administration and landed a job at a sustainable energy company with real benefits and actual career growth, and Alex had proposed on a random Tuesday night while we were cooking dinner. No grand gesture, just him looking at me and saying, "Let's get married." And I'd said yes before he even finished the sentence. We were planning a small wedding with just close friends, and Jenna was going to be my maid of honor, and my anonymous blog had grown to over 2,000 followers, with messages coming in weekly from people thanking me for giving them the courage to leave toxic situations. And then I got the call from an unknown number, with my father's voice coming through shaky and small, saying, "Your mother had a stroke. She's in the hospital. She's asking for you." I felt my whole body tense, and Alex looked up from his laptop concerned. And after I hung up, I talked it through with him and my therapist. Not because I owed my mother anything, but because I needed closure for myself. So I went to the hospital that smelled like disinfectant and fear. And I found my father in the waiting room looking a decade older than the last time I'd seen him. And Madison was there too, with Emma sleeping in a stroller beside her. My father stood when he saw me and started to say, "Violet, I'm so sorry for everything. I was wrong." But I held up my hand and said, "Stop. I didn't come here for apologies that don't mean anything. I came to say goodbye to who we never were as a family." And his face crumpled, but I kept going, because I needed to say this. My mother was awake when I walked into her room, weak but conscious, looking at me with those same cold eyes, and I said quietly, "I hope you recover, but I won't be part of your life. I built something real for myself, something good and healthy, and I won't let you destroy it." And she opened her mouth to respond, but I was already turning to leave because I'd said what I needed to say. In the hallway, Madison caught my arm and said, "Thank you for coming." And I looked at Emma sleeping peacefully and innocent and said, "Take care of her. Break the cycle." And Madison promised, "I will." And I walked out of that hospital and found Alex waiting in the parking lot. And I got in the car and the tears came, not from sadness or regret, but from final complete release, like something that had been wrapped around my chest for years had finally let go. 3 months later, I married Alex in a small ceremony at a garden venue with 20 people who actually loved us and who'd chosen to be there. And Jenna cried during the vows, and I wore a simple dress I'd bought on sale and felt more beautiful than I'd ever felt in my life. And during our first dance, I looked around at the people celebrating with us. Real family, chosen family, people who'd shown up when it mattered. Happy? Alex whispered. And I thought about that scared girl sleeping in her car and the long nights on Jenna's couch and every hard choice that had led me here. And I said, yeah, I really am. Because my parents had wanted me to serve them forever, to sacrifice my life for their comfort. But instead, I'd learned to serve myself, my dreams, and my peace, and my future. And that, I realized as I danced with my husband under string lights and surrounded by people who actually loved me, was the best revenge. Not bitterness or anger or proving them wrong, but just living well and being free and choosing every single day to put myself first. And I never apologized for it again, because I'd finally understood that taking care of myself wasn't selfish. It was survival, and survival had led me here, to this moment, to this life I'd built from nothing, to this happiness that was real and earned and completely mine. They didn't break me, they freed me, and I was never going back.